I stood alone at my husband Mark's graveside watching the mahogany casket lower into the rain-soaked earth with a sound so final it felt like the world was closing its eyes forever. The wind was a sharp blade against my face, but the cold on the outside was nothing compared to the absolute freezing realization that had just settled into my marrow. I looked behind me at the rows of empty chairs specifically reserved for my family. No mother, no sister, no father, just me and a few of Mark's distant colleagues standing under black umbrellas like a cluster of crows. I had sent the messages, and I had called a dozen times, but they had all replied with the same hollow heart emojis and promises of support that never arrived. I thought they were stuck in traffic, or perhaps the grief was simply too much for them to bear. But I was wrong. While I was burying the man who had been my entire world for 12 years, my mother and sister were 5 miles away sitting in a plush leather office finalizing the paperwork to have me declared mentally incompetent. They weren't mourning a son-in-law who had paid their bills for a decade. They were celebrating because Mark's sudden heart failure meant a $4.2 million estate was suddenly within their reach. They thought I was the same soft girl I had always been, the one who would do anything to keep the peace, and the one who believed that blood was thicker than water. They were about to learn that when you try to rob a widow at her husband's grave, you don't just lose a daughter, you create a monster with a very long memory and a very calm plan. Stay with me, because the receipts I gathered over the next 48 hours didn't just stop their plan, they dismantled their entire lives. And I am going to show you exactly how I did it. My name is Elena, and I have spent 34 years being the designated peacekeeper of the Miller family. For as long as I can remember, my mother Diane and my sister Sarah saw me as a resource rather than a person. When I married Mark, who was a brilliant architect from a family of quiet generational wealth, my mother didn't congratulate me on finding love. She congratulated me on finding a solution to our family's financial mediocrity. Mark was a kind soul who loved me so deeply that he tolerated their constant demands for the sake of my happiness. He paid for Sarah's wedding to a man who had never held a job for more than 3 months. He covered my mother's mortgage when she decided she needed a house she couldn't afford. He was the foundation we all stood on, but the moment that foundation crumbled, my family didn't try to help me rebuild, they tried to steal the stones. The day of the funeral began with a strange silence. I had woken up in our bedroom, the air still smelling faintly of Mark's cologne, and I felt a sense of dread that had nothing to do with the service. My mother had texted me at 7 in the morning saying that she had a terrible migraine and might be a little late. Sarah followed suit saying her car wouldn't start, but that she was calling an Uber. I believed them because I wanted to believe them. I went to the cemetery and stood there in the mud waiting for the people who were supposed to hold me up. When the service ended and the last mourner had shaken my hand, I drove back to our house expecting to find them there with casseroles and comfort. Instead, I found the front door wide open and the sound of laughter echoing from the kitchen. I walked into my own home and saw my sister Sarah standing on a step stool in the pantry. She was holding a set of vintage crystal glasses that had belonged to Mark's grandmother. She wasn't crying. She was telling my mother that these would sell for at least $2,000 on the resale market. My mother was sitting at the kitchen island with a stack of folders she had pulled from Mark's private office. She was circling figures in red pen and talking about how the property taxes on a place this size were a waste of money, and that I would be much happier in a small assisted living facility where I wouldn't have to worry about the upkeep. They didn't even notice me standing in the doorway for a full minute. When Sarah finally looked up, she didn't apologize. She just smiled and said that they were helping me get a head start on the transition because they knew I was too fragile to handle the details. That was the moment the peacekeeper died. I felt a strange clicking sensation in my chest, like a lock turning into place. I didn't scream and I didn't cry. I simply pulled out my phone and hit the record button. I walked into the kitchen and asked them very quietly what they were doing. My mother didn't even look up from the folders. She said that Mark had left a very complicated will and that given my history of anxiety, I wasn't in the right headspace to manage millions of dollars. She told me that she had already spoken to a lawyer friend and that they were going to help me sign over the power of attorney so that the family could manage the estate collectively. She said it was for my own protection, because people would try to take advantage of a wealthy widow. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. I looked at Sarah, who was now wrapping the crystal glasses in bubble wrap she had brought from her own house. She had come prepared to loot. She told me that she and her husband were going to move into the guest wing to keep an eye on me, and that they would be taking over the daily expenses. I realized then that they had been planning this from the moment the hospital called to say Mark hadn't made it. They hadn't missed the funeral because of car trouble or migraines. They had missed it because they needed the house to be empty so they could find Mark's passwords and legal documents. I asked them what happened to the trust Mark had set up for his nephew's education. My mother scoffed and said that the nephew was on Mark's side of the family and that blood should stay with blood. She said that money was much better suited for Sarah's new business venture. It was then that I realized the depth of their delusion. They thought that because Mark was gone, the wall he had built around me was gone too. They didn't realize that Mark had spent his final years building a fortress specifically designed to keep people like them out. I spent the next 3 hours playing the part they expected. I acted confused and overwhelmed. I let them tell me what to do, and I even let them lead me to the living room to sit down while they continued to take inventory of my life. Every word they said was being captured by the phone in my pocket. Every plan to sell Mark's car, every scheme to liquidate the retirement accounts, and every insult they threw at his memory was recorded. They talked about me as if I weren't even in the room, calling me weak and lucky that I had a family to thank for me. By the time they left that evening, they had a box of my jewelry and a sense of total victory. My mother hugged me and told me that the lawyer would be over on Monday morning with the papers for me to sign. She told me to get some rest and not to worry about a thing, because the Miller family always looked out for its own. As soon as their taillights disappeared down the driveway, I went to Mark's office. I sat in his chair and I opened the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk. There was a hidden compartment that only I knew about. Inside was a black leather binder with a note on the front that said, "For Elena, in case they forget who you are." Mark had been an architect, which meant he was obsessed with structural integrity. He had seen the way my mother and sister look at our life for years. He had noticed the way they only called when they needed a check. He had secretly recorded conversations of his own years ago when my mother had tried to ask him for a loan behind my back, using my supposed mental health as leverage. Even then, the binder was filled with evidence of their past grief, but it also contained a very specific legal document called an undue influence protection rider. Mark had consulted with a top-tier estate litigator to ensure that if anyone ever tried to claim I was incompetent or tried to pressure me into changing the will, the entire estate would immediately shift into a locked trust that no one could touch but me and a court-appointed guardian of my choosing. But I didn't just want to stop them. I wanted them to understand the cost of their betrayal. I spent the rest of the night transcribing the recordings I had made. I looked at the photos Sarah had posted on her private social media account during the funeral, are showing her posing in my master bedroom with the caption, "Finally moving up in the world." I saw the emails between my mother and her lawyer friend discussing how to fast-track the guardianship hearing before I could hire my own representation. They thought they were moving fast, but I was already miles ahead of them. The next morning, I didn't call a regular lawyer. I called a man named Silas, who was known in our city as the pitbull of probate. I told him everything and I sent him the files. When he heard the recording of my mother talking about moving me into a facility while I was still standing in my kitchen, he let out a low whistle. He told me that we could just file a cease and desist. But I told him no. I wanted the Monday morning meeting to happen. I wanted them to bring their lawyer. And I wanted them to bring their papers. I wanted them to be at the peak of their confidence before the floor fell out from under them. I spent Sunday afternoon visiting Mark's, and the only person who had actually stayed by my side at the SEM. Edri, she told me something that changed my entire perspective. She said that Mark had told her a month before he died that he was worried about me because I had too much heart for a family with so much hunger. He had told her that he had left me a gift that wasn't just money, but the ability to finally say no. I realized then that my revenge wasn't just for me, but for the man who had spent his life protecting. A girl who didn't know she was being hunted. Monday morning arrived with a cold gray sky. My mother and Sarah showed up at 10 sharp wearing their best funeral attire, looking solemn and prepared. They brought a man named Mr. Henderson who looked like he bought his suits from a thrift store and his ethics from a dumpster. They sat in my living room and spread the papers out on the coffee table. My mother took my hand, her voice dripping with fake honey, as she told me that this was the first step toward my healing. She told me that once I signed these papers, I wouldn't have to think about money or the house ever again. Sarah was already scrolling through her phone, probably looking at more furniture. I looked at the papers. They were even worse than I thought. It wasn't just power of attorney. It was a total transfer of assets into a family LLC managed by my mother and Sarah. They were effectively trying to turn me into a ward of the state in my own home. I looked up at Mr. Henderson and asked him if he had reviewed these documents for fairness. He cleared his throat and said that in his professional opinion, this was the most stable path for a widow in my condition. I stood up and walked to the window. I could see Silas's black sedan pulling into the driveway. I turned back to them, and I didn't look like the grieving girl they knew. I looked like the woman Mark had built this life for. I told them that I wouldn't be signing anything today. My mother's face shifted instantly. The honey was gone and the vinegar was back. She told me that I wasn't in my right mind and that if I didn't sign, they would be forced to take this to a judge immediately, which would be much more embarrassing for me. Sarah chimed in, saying that I was being selfish and that Mark would be ashamed of me for turning my back on family when they were just trying to help. It was then that Silas walked through the front door. He didn't knock. He just entered with a briefcase that looked like it cost more than Sarah's car. He walked into the living room and handed Mr. Henderson a thick blue folder. He told them that his name was Silas Vance and that he was representing the estate of Mark Miller and its sole beneficiary, Lena Miller. He told them that the meeting was over and that they had exactly 10 minutes to leave the property before the police arrived to escort them off for trespassing and attempted grand larceny. The look on my mother's face was something I will treasure for the rest of my life. She tried to bluster, saying that she was the mother and she had rights. Silas just smiled a cold, sharp smile. He told her that he had already reviewed the recordings of their little looting session from Friday. He mentioned the forged medical affidavits they had tried to file and the fact that he had already been in contact with the state bar regarding Mr. Henderson's involvement in a fraudulent guardianship scheme. Sarah started to cry, but it wasn't grief, it was fear. She realized the dream home and the crystal glasses were slipping away. But this was only the beginning of the storm. I watched them scramble to gather their things, their hands shaking as they realized that the girl who always said yes had finally learned to say no. As they walked out the door, I told my mother that I would see her in court, not for the money, but for the fraud. I realized then that the calmest part of revenge is the moment you realize you no longer care what they think of you. Part 2 of this story is going to get much darker because when people like my mother get backed into a corner, they don't give up, they get dangerous, and I was about to find out just how far they would go to keep their hands on Mark's millions. The silence that followed the slamming of the front door was the loudest thing I had ever heard. For a few minutes, I just stood in the center of the foyer listening to the settling of the house that Mark and I had built with so much love and so much care. The air felt lighter, but I knew that the storm was not over. It had simply moved from my living room to the shadows where my mother and sister operated best. Silas looked at me and told me that the first blow was struck, but the counterattack would be fast. And it would be dirty. He was right. Within 2 hours of them being escorted off my property, my phone, began to vibrate with a frequency that felt like a physical assault. It started with the flying monkeys, the extended family members, and family friends who had been fed a carefully crafted narrative of my supposed mental breakdown. My Aunt Martha called first, her voice dripping with that condescending pity that feels like a slap. She told me she heard I had hired a high-priced lawyer to keep my own mother out of the house during my time of grief, and that Mark would be rolling in his grave to see me acting so cold. I did not argue. I did not explain. I simply told her that if she wanted to know the truth, she should ask Diane why she was looking at furniture catalogs while I was standing at the cemetery. Then came the social media posts. Sarah had posted a black and white photo of us from childhood with a caption about how heartbreaking it is to watch a sister lose her mind to grief and how she was praying for my recovery and for the strength to protect our family's legacy. The comments were filled with people calling me heartless and entitled. This was the strategy they had chosen to use the court of public opinion to shame me into submission. They thought that because I was a private person, I would crumble under the weight of community judgment. They did not realize that I had already moved past the point of caring about the opinions of people who had not been there to hold my hand when Mark's heart stopped. On Tuesday, Silas called me into his office. He had been doing some digging into the financial records of my sister's husband, Simon, and what he found was the missing piece of the puzzle. It turned out that Simon hadn't just lost a few $1,000s at the track, he had embezzled nearly $400,000 from the construction firm where he worked as a bookkeeper. He was facing a massive audit in 3 weeks, and if he didn't replace the funds, he was going to prison. My mother and sister weren't just being greedy, they were desperate. They needed Mark's estate to cover a crime, and they were willing to destroy me to get it. Silas also discovered that the lawyer friend my mother had brought over, Mr. Henderson, had been disbarred in the neighboring state 5 years ago for similar predatory guardianship schemes. They were a pack of wolves who had found a way to look like sheep, and they were coming for the only thing I had left. The next few days were a blur of preparation. I spent hours in Mark's office going through every digital file he had left behind. Mark was a man of systems, and he had a hidden server that automatically backed up our home security footage to a cloud account he had named The Vault. I logged in and began to scroll through the dates leading up to his death and the days following. That was when I found it. I found footage from the night before the funeral. My mother and Sarah had used a spare key. I didn't know they had to enter the house at 2 in the morning. The camera in the hallway captured them walking toward the office. I watched in horror as my mother stood lookout while Sarah used a professional-grade document scanner to copy Mark's private ledgers. But the most damning part was the audio. They were standing right under the camera in the kitchen, and my mother was telling Sarah that they needed to make sure the forged doctor's note looked authentic, because if the judge saw it and believed Elena was incapacitated, the trust would fall into their hands within 30 days. Sarah laughed and said that Elena was too stupid to ever check the medical portal, and that by the time I realized what was happening, the house would be sold and they would be in the clear. I sat there in the dark watching my own mother plot my destruction, and for the first time I felt a cold clarity that surpassed any grief. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a war. Silas and I met with the district attorney on Thursday. When I showed him the footage and the recordings of the looting, his expression went from professional curiosity to genuine disgust. He told me that we had enough for a criminal investigation into fraud and attempted grand larceny, but he advised me to wait for the formal guardianship hearing on Friday. He wanted them to commit their lives on the record under oath before we dropped the hammer. He said that if we moved early, they might find a way to pivot, but if we let them testify, they would be trapped in a cage of their own making. Friday morning arrived, and the courthouse felt like a tomb. I arrived with Silas and Mark's Aunt Alice, who was the only one who knew the full truth. My mother and Sarah were already there, sitting in the front row looking like the picture of grieving elegance in their black veils and pearls. They had hired a new lawyer, this time a legitimate one who clearly didn't know the full extent of his client's depravity. When the judge called the hearing to order, my mother took the stand first. She put on a performance that would have won an Oscar. She cried about how much she loved me and how she was only doing this because she saw me talking to wolves and refusing to eat. She said I had become a danger to myself and that the millions Mark had left me were a burden I couldn't carry. She testified under oath that she had never entered my home without permission and that she had only ever acted in my best interest. Then it was Sarah's turn. She testified that I had threatened to burn the house down and that I had told her I wanted to give all the money to a cult. She was so convincing that I saw the court reporter look at me with genuine fear. When it was our turn, Silas didn't start with an argument. He simply asked the judge for permission to play a video. My mother's lawyer objected, but Silas explained that it was relevant to the claims of my mental state. The lights dimmed and the footage from the night before the funeral filled the screens in the courtroom. There was my mother and sister in the middle of the night scanning documents and laughing about how they were going to trick the stupid widow. The silence in the courtroom was so heavy you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. My mother's face went from pale to a ghostly gray. Sarah started to shake. But Silas wasn't done. He then presented the audit report from Simon's employer and the proof of the $400,000 embezzlement. He explained to the judge that the motivation for this guardianship wasn't love or concern, but the need to cover up a felony. The judge's reaction was swifter than I could have imagined. She didn't just deny their petition, she ordered an immediate freeze on all of my mother and sister's personal assets pending a fraud investigation. She referred the case to the district attorney for perjury and attempted theft. But the final moment of the calm revenge came when Silas invoked the undue influence protection rider that Mark had hidden in the trust. He explained that because the family had attempted to use legal coercion and fraud to gain access to the estate the secondary legacy fund Mark had set up for them was now officially dissolved. That $500,000, which was meant to be their safety net after my death, was now being redirected to a scholarship fund for the children of the architects Mark had mentored. They had traded a $500,000 inheritance for a chance at $4 million, and they had ended up with nothing but a looming prison sentence. As we walked out of the courtroom, my mother tried to reach for my arm, her voice a frantic whisper. She told me she was sorry and that she was only doing what she thought was best for the family. She told me that I couldn't let my own sister go to jail and that I had to help Simon or they would lose everything. I looked at her and I didn't see a mother anymore. I saw a stranger who had tried to bury me while I was still breathing. I told her that she was right about one thing, that I was in a different headspace now. I told her that the Elena who allowed herself to be a doormat died at Mark's grave, and the woman standing in front of her was the one who was going to make sure that justice was served. I told her that I wouldn't be paying for their lawyers, and I wouldn't be answering their calls. I was finally moving on, and they were finally going to have to live in the world they had created. The months that followed were a season of rebuilding. Simon was eventually sentenced to 5 years for embezzlement, and Sarah had to sell her house and moved back into my mother's cramped bedroom apartment. The community that had once judged me based on their lies eventually saw the court transcripts, and the tide of opinion turned so sharply that my mother could no longer show her face at the grocery store without being whispered about. I didn't take joy in their suffering, but I did find peace in their absence. I used the estate to start the Mark Miller Foundation, which provides housing and legal support for widows who are being targeted by predatory family members. I turned my pain into a shield for others. On the 1-year anniversary of Mark's death, I went back to the cemetery. This time there were no empty chairs. I brought Aunt Alice and the young architects who are now flourishing because of the fund. I placed a single white rose on his grave, and I whispered that the fortress he built had held firm. I told him that I was not just safe, but I was strong. I realized that the best revenge and a loud confrontation or a physical blow, it is the act of thriving in spite of those who tried to destroy you. I am Elena, and I have learned that while blood connects us, it is character that defines us. One chose my own family now, and it is built on a foundation of truth that no storm can wash away. If you found strength in their conclusion of Alana's story and believe that no one should ever be a victim of their own family's greed, please like this video and subscribe to My Calm Revenge. Your support helps us bring more of these stories to light and build a community where justice and resilience come first. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story of standing up for what is right.